and welcome Virtual Space Hero community to today's Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live. And we're picking up on a topic that we have been discussing also last week with a renowned expert here in Europe based in Spain. She was talking about healthy, happy homeworking. You remember we were talking with Maya Middlemiss herself, a home worker for over 20 years, and she shared with us the strategies to work healthy and happy from home. Today, we change slightly the location, but we always talk about virtual work and new ways of working. And we're going to talk about how can we create better communities through better co-working. And honestly, I myself, I do visit occasionally co-working spaces, but I must say I'm a total home worker. Nevertheless, I'm more than excited because today I welcome on the Virtual Space Hero stage here with me Alex Hillman, the founder of Indyhall, one of the first co-workings across the globe that opened up around 15 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And with that, I'm opening the virtual doors for Alex, who joins me today. Hi there, Alex.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Alex, thank you so much for freeing up your agenda and taking the time to be here with us to talk about co-working. Well, and I already said you were one of the first co-working spaces across the globe. Let us know, how did you come up with the idea of creating a co-working space and whether it was really 15 years ago?
Just over 15 years ago. You're absolutely right. So I had, obviously there was no pandemic happening 15 years ago. And remote work wasn't even all that common. It was it's sort of like an occasional perk for very few people. But what happened for me was I left a full-time job to go out on my own and begin freelancing. And that was how I ended up working at home. I was a web developer. I was working out of my bedroom, as many people find themselves when they're first out on their own. And when I went out on my own, a big motivation for me was freedom, flexibility, and choice. Where I worked, when I worked, how I worked, who I worked with. So again, things that are really common in the conversation around remote work these days. But the one thing that I missed the most, and I realized this very quickly when I went on my own, was I missed having coworkers. As strange as that sounds sometimes, I was really fortunate to have worked in some agencies where I had coworkers who were really smart, really talented, really supportive, and the ability to learn from smart people who you work with, the ability to ask a question when you're stuck on something without having to sort of sit there and stew over it. The inspiration and the energy of being around other creative people, I really missed that. At the same time, I knew I didn't want to start an agency of my own. I really did want to remain independent. And I did not have the resources to go rent an office or anything like that. But again, the problem in my mind, I wasn't thinking I need an office. I was thinking I need other people. And so I went out and I started finding those people, sometimes online. I actually made friends early on. Many of my coworkers were in other cities outside of Philadelphia. And actually learned about the ideas of co-working before there was really any dedicated spaces for it from some friends in San Francisco. And when I watched them sort of get the first versions of these sort of ad hoc co-working spaces off the ground, I thought, well, maybe this is a thing that would make sense here in Philadelphia, where it's really hard to find other independent people because we're all in our bedrooms or spare rooms or whatever it is. And craving that sense of community when there isn't a place to find other people is really the thing that led to me creating Indyhall, which again, at the very beginning, for the entire first year, wasn't a place. It was a group of people who were actively looking for other people like themselves, like-minded, but different industry or different specialization and things like that. So we spent an entire year building this club of freelancers and entrepreneurs and remote workers, and eventually the club wanted a clubhouse, and that brought me back to understanding of these sort of community workspaces that friends in San Francisco had started. And I said, I think that makes sense here as well. And we came up with the membership model that is kind of the default at most co-working spaces. That didn't exist at the time. It was always either some agency subsidizing the cost, or it was more like a cooperative. So the idea of a flexible membership model I think is one of our earliest contributions to this thing that at the time we had no idea would become the global phenomenon, in part because we had no idea that remote work would become the phenomenon that it is today either. So it wasn't so much that I set out to start a co-working space, but I set out to build a community of people to surround myself with, and found that I was not the only one who wanted other people. And then realized that once we did have a place to gather, it became easier for other people to walk through the door physically or virtually, and want to be a part of that as well.
If you think about that, so what your reasons were to come up with the idea of having that co-working space in the hall, and if you think about why people nowadays are joining a co-working space, so you were seeking a community 15 years ago, did that change the reasons why people look for co-working, or are there more reasons now, not only the co-working part?
Yeah, there's definitely been, I mean, co-working, I'd say like for the first 7 years or so, people would find out about Indyhall, usually from an Indyhall member, or maybe a little bit of press, or an event that we did outside of our space. We did a lot of things inside of, bars and other event spaces, and a lot of collaborations. People would find out about Indyhall and then find out that Indyhall was a version of this thing called co-working that was happening in other cities around the world. And then co-working started becoming more mainstream. I think part of the interesting factor there is like what brought co-working mainstream. It was giant, heavily funded companies like WeWork, right? And what WeWork was popularizing under the same name of co-working was low cost, low commitment access to space, which technically we had, but that wasn't the heart of what we did. And it created this new challenge where we, in many cases, we had to educate folks that were walking in our door saying, I want to rent an office, or even I want to rent a desk. And we'd say, well, we don't really rent desks here. Technically, you pay a monthly membership and you can come work at a desk. But we really kind of tried to remove the words, the rental mindset from what we did. And it was always a challenge. So I think the big thing that's changed is the market is more educated about co-working as an option, but most people's interaction with co-working is a lot less like what we've done and still do to this day. So that's a really interesting challenge as the market fluxes. The reasons that people join co-working spaces today, I think, include I want to be around other people. And when people show up to Indyhall because they want to be around other people, they're in the right place. But when people show up because they want a low commitment, low cost office, we might not be the best option. There's other options for that. They want a private office. We don't have private offices. So you can go to a place that rents out private offices. I think, the pandemic in particular, since it pushed so many people to work from home who hadn't necessarily chosen it for themselves, and they didn't have they don't have a spare room, so they're working from their dining room table, or they don't have a very good internet connection, or they have other people living with them, or family members, or the distractions of home, dishes and laundry and all these other things. So people are also joining co-working spaces to get out of the house, I think, is a very common thing that we hear, and a common way that co-working spaces often position themselves as an alternative to being at home. But I think that the thing that is especially challenging is reminding folks that, especially after a year and a half of being at home by yourself, that if you're going to come into a place that has you around other people, you also need to interact in a different way than if you're in your own home by yourself. And there's an entire kind of like re-education, reacclimation process that I think every real world workspace is figuring out how to navigate. And we have kind of a different set of incentives to figure out and experiment. How do you reacclimate people to being around other people? And it's a little different too when you choose the people that you're around, right? In a corporate environment or an office environment, it's typically, I want to go to this office, but the people that I'm around are the people that also were employed by this company. I think the people who are happiest in the co-working spaces that they choose it because of the other people in the room. And that could be something as ephemeral as a vibe, or it could be something as specific as there are people from certain industries that I want to learn from, or there's people who are maybe a little more advanced and I want to be around them because I want to level up in some way. But I think that's a under discussed aspect of how people and why people choose a co-working space. The last thing I'll say is, like, the range of reasons that people join a co-working space is often very different from the reasons that they stay. And for whatever reason somebody ends up walking in the doors of Indyhall, the reason they stay invariably is the other people. And so we just try and we try and communicate that as early and as often as possible, because we know that if there's a thing that's going to keep you wanting to be a part of this community, it's the other people. And ultimately, the beauty of that is you become part of the other people for another member as well. So the true networking community effect is every person in the community becomes part of the value of the community to another member, which means every new person who joins, the potential value of the community actually goes up.
Fantastic example. So it also relates to what Patricia is saying there. Thanks a lot, Patricia, for your comment. Great topic. The need to connect with others is real, definitely. And co-working spaces, they provided this space not to rent, but rather to connect with other people, not to rent a table or desk only, but also, of course, and you're right, Alex, there are also people who might just want to rent a table or a desk or a private office just to be alone in a place where they don't have to talk to anybody, which is totally legit. It's just a different reason.
Exactly.
When we talk about co-working spaces, so you also mentioned that you started more than 15 years ago, something that now has become very popular. Not only since the last year, I've seen a growing trend in the past, probably 5 years already, in the countries that I move in or that I work mainly with, that co-working has become very popular, not only for freelancers and small businesses, but also for bigger corporations who are renting tables, desks for their employees who are working remotely. How do you see that balance there? Is it still mainly freelancers, digital nomads, smaller companies, or has the share of multinationals, to say so, or big corporations who are renting hot desks or whatever desks for their employees, has that increased?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. We've long had a pretty unique perspective on this because we've really designed around individuals, not companies. And a lot of co-working spaces designed their operations and their business model around companies with the idea that if I sign a deal with one company, and ideally that company is growing, that means that the revenue that comes from them are going to grow. So the economic incentives are at least theoretically aligned. I can answer this from sort of two perspectives. The first, I'll say from a business perspective, as an operator of a co-working space, more people attached to one membership, so to speak, or one agreement sounds like a good thing until you're up for renegotiation. And a larger portion of your revenue coming from a single source is actually a liability in my experience. And so when we periodically have somebody who comes in as an individual and their company grows because they start collaborating with people, they hire people from the community. Now they're 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. When they get past 3, 4, or 5 people, we're having a conversation where I say, you need to start looking for another option. For reasons that I'll get into in a second, but also I'm clear with them. I say, I know from your perspective, it might seem like it's good for us for you to be paying us more, but it's actually a liability because I know at some point you're going to leave. And it's harder for me to replace 5 memberships at once than it is, individual memberships. So from a business model perspective, that's a strategic choice. From a community perspective, I think it's actually even more important. I'll give you a really concrete example. And this is, again, with a small company, but you can think about how this scales to big companies. I'll come back to that in a moment. We had a group of 3 women who had started a video production company here in the city. We met them at one of our events. They connected with people at the event. They're like, oh, Indyhall, this is like a community we want to be a part of. We're a new business. This is going to be great for support and networking and learning. And they were coming in for a few months, and then they turned to one of our teammates and said, hey, we've been coming to Indyhall for a little while, and we love it and we get it, but we also feel kind of disconnected, and we're trying to figure out why that is. Did we do something wrong? Are we doing something wrong? Are we missing something? And he said, well, if I can make an observation, the three of you come in together, you sit together, you talk together, you go to lunch together, you come back from lunch together, you sit together again, then you leave together. And there's not a whole lot of room for Indyhall in between the three of you. And maybe if you thought about, if you are going to come in on the same day, sit apart from each other. It's not that you can't sit together, but choose to sit together on purpose when you want to have a conversation or a meeting or a discussion or a brainstorm. But the rest of the time, go spread out in the office and sit next to people who aren't each other and make a little bit of room for those interactions and connections to happen. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they got. And so I think if you start thinking about this from a perspective of bringing in even larger organizations and companies, again, I think it comes down to like, what do you want to get out of it? They wanted to interact with other people. And there was this sort of unobvious thing where they would gravitate towards their own coworkers who they already knew and in a way reduce, remember what I said, every person in the room is value for every other member. And so if you only talk to your coworkers, you're actually reducing the overall value in the room by being sort of like an isolated little pod of insular, inward focused. You get what I'm saying? So when it comes to working with bigger organizations, we need to be really clear, hey, if you're going to come in, you can't sit together. And if that's a problem, then we're already done here. You can go rent a floor somewhere else with somebody else who will do a short-term lease with you. That's not what we're about. And for the organizations that have taken us up on that, it's worked exactly the way they wanted to. It's an interesting, like counterintuitive piece.
And you know what, Alex, I'm just thinking about, have you probably have heard about activity-based working? I'm not sure how you refer to it in the US. Activity-based working, okay. So I was working in a university and we were the first university in Austria implementing activity-based working. And of course, I was a researcher of new ways of working. So I do know the advantages, disadvantages of activity-based working. I do know, of course, the big advantages of a company to downsize office space to some extent, that's clear. And we started doing that, and you can imagine, an expert organization with professors with many degrees, they giving up all their office. It was a horror. It was really horrible. Anyways, some of them, of course, could stay with their office because otherwise impossible to get them on board. But the point was, and that's what I'm seeing a lot with many organizations that I'm working with, the moment that they start with the concept of activity-based working, very often, even though they are asked and incentivated, not forced, because organizations at the end, they cannot force them to not sit together, or at least the organizations I work with, they never decided to do so. And the problem is exactly what you were describing, that there is nothing different before or after activity-based working, where the idea would be to have more people communicating, sitting next to members of another department, another area, new colleagues, so that information exchange, communication, getting to know each other, never worked, honestly, because people, and that is also the challenge. We are sort of, and I would like now to know your answer. We are like, how do you say in English? We are like those, we like to be in the same space. We like what we know and we like to stick there. So for example, how do you deal with that in your co-working, probably people are always sitting at the same table, or do you rotate them? Do you see what I mean? Because that is the main challenge.
Absolutely. Well, and I always say, like, if you're going to shift towards any of these new forms or new, even like the shift to like open floor plans, and people talk about how bad open floor plans are. And I say, well, anything is bad for you when you don't know how to use it or when it's been forced upon you. So to answer your question directly, one of the things that we did from a design perspective to encourage that kind of mixing and changing, there's two layers to it. One is, when we set up our clusters of desks for people to work at, we had two different colored desks. There was a light colored desk, almost like a beige. That was a flex desk for anyone who was there for the day. They're there for a couple of days a week, but it's not a dedicated desk. And then we do have dedicated desks for people who want to set up their own computer, their own monitor, and leave their belongings. A lot of co-working spaces and offices, frankly, separate those. Here's the hot desking area, and here is the dedicated desk area. And we very intentionally mixed them. Every cluster of desks had both. And what would happen is you'd have, in a cluster of, let's say, 5 desks, you'd have 2 full-time desks, maybe 3. And those people are kind of like little cultural anchors of that tiny little cluster. But then the flex desks are people who choose to sit next to them on that day. And as you said, people are habitual, and so they're going to find their favorite spot based on
Habitual, that's the word. That's
yes,
the word I
yes.
was looking for. Thanks.
So they're going to pick the spot that they like because of the lighting or the sound or the people or whatever the dynamic is, and that becomes the spot that they choose as a default. It's the habit. And what happens is, because these clusters are mixed, and those flex desks are mixed with the full-time desks. If it was just a cluster of full-time desks, it's the same people sitting next to the same people all the time. But by mixing full-time and flex, what would happen often enough is you would come in and someone else is sitting in your favorite flex desk because we've reduced them into these clusters. And so you're like, all right, I got to pick another spot, right? And that puts you next to a different person. So that little change helps create sort of a natural churn. There's one more thing that we did, and that people, their minds are blown when they hear that we do this. Once a year, everybody packs up their desk. All the full-time desks put their stuff in a box. We treat it kind of like spring cleaning, where we, tidy up, and maybe we brainstorm a list of projects and improvements and things like that for the space. And when we put things back, the rule is you have to sit in a new place with new people. And so again, it's just like the longest people will be habituated is about a year. And what's interesting is, because of a variety of things, there's been a couple of times in our history where it would go on longer, maybe 18 months, 2 years between one of these. We called it reboot. And the amount of pain that reboot causes it exists no matter what, but it's relatively small, and we've learned how to manage it and set expectations. But if you wait 2 years and do it, people have put down roots. They become territorial, and it becomes not just 2 times harder, it's 10 times harder. And so, like, having a rhythm where the expectation is set, things can change, but it's for this reason, and it's a reason that gives you a thing that you want, not just because I said so. It doesn't make all the pain go away, but it helps guide people through it and makes it kind of worth it.
Great examples. And yes, exactly. Those are the two things that I also observe when I work with organizations. People are habitual and territorial. That's the main challenge. And even though what I see, and now I'm really interested on how you do that through better co-working, creating better communities, because I'm just thinking how we can sort of adopt your principles to an organizational context as well, to create better organizations through, or better teams through better co-working in the organization itself. Because when we are implementing in the projects that I'm working with, when we're implementing activity-based working or new concepts, when there's a change going on, and it's accompanied even properly, and people know why, even though some of them were forced into it, because nobody's ever happy with a change to an activity-based working, that's clear. Still, I see very often that exactly those things that we want to happen, they don't occur. And if you talk about better co-working to create better communities, you gave us already a few examples. Are there some more examples that could be also used in the organizational context? Yeah. When we talk about, like you were saying, mixing up the flex desk, the hot desk. But for example, in activity-based working, you already have those zones, like the areas, activity-based working areas. That's an area where you cannot talk. That's the area where you talk, the area where you have phone calls, the area of projects. So it's already not so easy to mix all them up. I'm not sure. What's your take on that?
So I think the challenge here, and different companies have different cultures around this in general, and it also, like, this gets harder the bigger the organization is. But my number one answer by far is to shift these from things that a leader or a decision maker in the organization does. Try and shift the way you do it into something that is modeled around co-creation. So I think that the underlying pattern here is, regardless of what the change is, people don't like things being done to them, period. Even if it's good or better in some measurable, quantifiable way, even if they feel that, people don't like things being done to them. So the question becomes, how can you invite people into the process? How can you develop these ideas in a more collaborative way, where they have a sense of ownership over the change? In some cases, it's their ideas, their work, their hands, their contributions. In some cases, one of the things that we like to think about is, I think about it from a perspective of choice architecture. I might do the research, do the homework to come up with 2 or 3 really good ideas and present them to the group and say, here's the direction we're going and why we're going that way. Here's 2 or 3 ways that we think it might work, but we're also open to coming up with a 4th, a 5th, or your ideas for combining them. And I think that the best example that this like connects to and that folks might be familiar with is if you have young kids and you want to put them down to bed, a parenting technique. I don't have kids. I know you've got a young one yourself. The idea of telling your kid you want to go to bed in 15 minutes or in 30 minutes. And it doesn't matter what choice they make, they're going to be in bed at some point in the next 30 minutes. And so it's not that you're tricking people, it's that you're involving people in the decision-making process in a way that whatever decision that they make, that they feel a sense of ownership over that contribution, they can't choose wrong because you've already presented a couple of likely good choices for them you've narrowed it. But the other thing it does is, and I think this is maybe the hardest part for leadership to do and something that we work very hard at, is to still always be open to additional ideas. If I'm going to present a couple of good ideas for people to choose from, it's not a vote from these 3 options, those are your only 3 options. It's I'm open to a hidden option that we didn't think of, or a combination or a remix, or in some cases framing it as an experiment, saying, I want to take the idea that you presented, let's try it for 2 weeks and see what it looks like. So I don't think that there's any design choice that solves all these problems. I think it's more about the process through which the design choices are made and involving people in them. That sense of agency and decision making is so critical.
Yeah.
And it's tough.
Sorry for interrupting. Alex, it's really like what you were saying. I think it so much applies to the organizational context. I would come back to you in like 2 years to see how that goes with our son, right? Because what I heard from other parents is like, don't involve them too much until they are like 8 years old or something.
I don't know
I'm
what
not
the
so sure
right
about
age
that
is.
because now, well, he's only 8 months old, so there is nothing much happening yet. Lucky us, but we'll see. But I come back on that to you. But anyways, I think the suggestions that you're making in terms of co-creation, co-working, and there's always this binding element of making them part of the process that you were mentioning, that of course is super important. And that's then how we can create, through better co-working, better communities, better teams in our organizations. Let me pick up on a last aspect that I would love to discuss with you, because I'm aware that, of course, as well, pandemic hit Indyhall, and Indyhall was a co-working space with a beautiful office setup there in Philadelphia. And of course, through the pandemic, you also moved all your business virtual, and you had a virtual community before already, but you now were focusing, of course, through the pandemic, on virtual co-working. Can you describe us a little bit what happened there and how the virtual co-working is going, and particularly what community again has to do with that?
Yeah, it's been a really, really interesting time. Our co-working spaces around the world have been hit really hard. And it's been challenging from the start. I think we had an advantage in that online community and virtual community has been a part of what we did before, right? It's like I said, with that entire first year of us community building before we had our own space, we had online community as a main tool to stay in touch in between the once a week we would meet at a cafe or the library or whatever it was. So online community is already kind of in our DNA. And we're pretty good at the tools and the planning and the communication that a lot of people had to learn for the first time starting in, March and April of 2020. Even then, it was challenging and scary and weird to have those be our only way to communicate with each other. So, we have, I think of our online community as a few different distinct gathering places that are supported by different tools. The first one, the one that everybody knows, of course, Zoom, for those sort of live group conversation, sort of the sitting around a table kind of things. I know Zoom is often used for presentations, We do that occasionally, but we've got way more practice in how do you actually have a conversation with more than 2 or 3 people on Zoom. And that is a thing that is its own practice. Doesn't, conversations in person allow people to read body language and, pass conversations along and get a sense of where to, break into between people saying things. We had to learn how to do that and how to facilitate that as well. And that is very, very difficult, even when a tool is, as people are increasingly comfortable with. We used to use Slack. We had a Slack community for a very long time. We made the shift to Discord at the end of summer 2020 for a few reasons. But we found that Discord gave us better tools for community building than Slack did. While you might look at it from the outside and go, well, they're just chat tools with channels and things like that. That is all true. The two things that we have found really powerful with Discord, one is having just more control over how channels are organized, almost treating them like little villages of channels into categories. It's not just a navigational thing. We can also kind of think about it from a placemaking perspective. And you apply models and ideas from the placemaking, real world stuff to online spaces. People behave in them differently. And we had to do a lot of work to figure that out and have built that to be pretty robust now. Discord's voice channels have also allowed for an element of serendipity that was very, very difficult, if it was possible at all, before. And we actually have a number of channels that we use specifically for virtual co-working, where somebody can log into a voice channel. We actually have it configured so there is no voice. It's just video. And so as a little sidebar on your computer screen, you log in and you can see, there's 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes we get up to 10, 15, 20 people in a little grid. And it's modeled after this idea of body doubling, which comes from cognitive science and the idea of seeing somebody else working. Your brain kind of latches on and goes, okay, it's work mode now. And that's one of the benefits of being in a co-working space, is being around other people who are in work mode. This isn't as good, but it's way better than I expected it ever could be. And what's beautiful about Discord is it allows that effective, if you've ever been, in a co-working space, of course, or really any sort of community space where, 2 people are having a conversation and you notice them having a conversation, so you walk over to them. And now there's 3 people, and then somebody else notices 3 people having a conversation. Sort of like naturally, organically grows because there's a sense of presence. You see that there are people gathering, and Discord's voice channels allow for that in a way that other tools I haven't really seen, and we're continually experimenting with that sort of thing. So, it's a combination of scheduled, structured stuff or semi-structured things. So we don't do a lot of pre-scheduled programming where it's like a talk or a lecture or a lesson or a workshop. We do we have a once a week show and tell, and even that we're constantly playing with the framework and the conversation format for that. The most popular thing that we have is 2 times every morning, Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. Eastern, that we have a coffee chat, which we try to recreate that sense of when you walk into the kitchen in the morning and you see a couple of people there and you just talk about whatever's on your mind, what's going on in your day. It's a chance to meet people and have that free-flowing, more serendipitous conversation than you can get by going to meetings and even most virtual events. I think one of the challenges with Zoom is when everything happens in Zoom, and most things that happen in Zoom are meetings, everything starts to feel like a meeting. And so one of the things that we've worked very hard to do is both reframe the context however we can. In some cases, that's as simple as using the screen share to put a different background up while people are talking. We've been doing, during the summer, we were playing with the idea of having a campfire, like a literal video of a crackling campfire for people to sit around. And how does that change the dynamic? I think it all comes down to the hardest thing to create an online community, but also the most powerful, is anything that either is or feels more serendipitous. If everything is structured and is coming from the staff, the community manager, everything is coming top down to the point where if the people who run the community were to step away for a few days or longer, what would happen? If nothing would happen, then you probably like for me, that's like a clue that there's a problem. Most of the best stuff that's happening in our community throughout the pandemic is stuff that at most is facilitated by us, but it is actually driven by the presence of and the contribution of our community itself. So it's an ever evolving, ever changing, and again, we're in a season right now where we're adapting to people who, after a year and a half of not being able to leave the house, suddenly can because vaccination rates are safe, because their family is ready to start traveling and taking vacations, because at the end of a workday, the last thing they want to do is be in front of their computer anymore. And so we're doing almost as much experimentation today as we were at the very beginning of the pandemic, because like the beginning of the pandemic, it's a period of transition. And I think that's the thing to be on the lookout for, and the lesson to take away from online community is like, there is no snap the finger, do this thing and it works. It's you kind of have to set a North Star that people already want to do, involve them in the process like we were talking about before, and kind of commit to doing it long enough to see, is it something that has its own, that can create its own center of gravity, that will kind of self-perpetuate, or will mostly self-perpetuate with just a little bit of like guidance and support here and there. Because if all the efforts, if all the activities are coming from the top down, I'd almost go so far as to say I'm not sure if that's really a healthy community.
Not sustainable, absolutely.
Not sustainable. And it's also usually a clue that people don't feel comfortable or confident stepping up to take ownership and leadership of those things. So like, I think part of our job is to notice people who either already do, or maybe who could if they knew that they, or would if they knew that they could. Those are some of the subtle sort of community leadership moves, just to make it our job to lead by helping other people lead. I think that's another lesson that really translates into workplace culture is, leadership is often hierarchical and positional, which has its place. But I think, for managers to notice who else has maybe leadership qualities but doesn't think of themselves as a leader, or who do other people look to and respect even if they don't have positional power. And when you understand what those things are, you can actually, again, build and design experiences around that, knowing if this person's in the room, I have a good sense of who else will come into the room. If this person is speaking, I have a sense of who will or won't have a chance to speak. And always kind of like, there's a lot of things to be aware of, but those are the kinds of things that online community, on one hand, makes it easier to see everything that's going on, because in many cases there's some sort of record or activity log. Compared to in person, ephemeral things can happen outside of your field of vision and you have no idea whether or not they happen. The counterintuitive thing is, I think those things are happening out of field of view in online communities. They're happening in private channels or in direct messages on other platforms. And we pretend like they're not happening. And I feel like that's a huge mistake too. So yeah, those are some of the things that we've had to think about when online went from being a continuity tool to the only way to gather. And now we're kind of back to it being, for some members, it'll still be the only way to gather because they live in other cities, states, and countries. Half of our new members in the last 12 months are not in Philadelphia, which is very exciting. But it also creates this really interesting balancing act to play going forward, where online community for some people is the place where I see the people in between my visits to an in-person space. It is the only way I interact with the community. And for those people to not necessarily realize that it's different for each of them creates opportunities for tension and stress. And so constantly surfacing like, hey, there's more than one way to be a member of this community, and they are all important. They are all valued. That's a lot. It's real work. Community building work is extraordinarily difficult, and people who are good at it, I think, are extremely valuable. And a lot of the things we're talking about, I was just talking to a buddy of mine who's a CEO of a company here in the city, and they're they went from like 80% in person and 20% remote to like the other way around. And he's like, it's not my job to be the one doing all this dot connecting and the subtle work that I'm describing. But he's like, but we don't really have somebody else to do it. And I feel like if I'm the only one doing it like that's not sustainable, like you said. And I said, what you're describing to me, it sounds like this should be like an HR function. Like there should be a person whose job it is to do community. I hate the phrase community management, but community work is real work. And there, it should be somebody's responsibility inside any organization where the relationships between the people matter. And I can't think of an organization where the relationships between the people doesn't matter. So the community within an organization should be somebody's responsibility.
I think you're so right. I think there are a lot of takeaways that we can take into the organizational context coming out of your experience with Indyhall and the virtual co-working or co-working in general. I think also a remark from my side, I found it very interesting. One of our cohort members, we're running a certificate program to become a virtual learning designer and facilitator, only virtual. And she mentioned in one of our sessions, Kasha mentioned, well, now we had to transition everything to the virtual space, but now we have to re-transition back to another and a different setting, whether it's hybrid or whether it's a totally in-person setting, in-present setting, on-site, wherever she's teaching. Alex, it was amazing. You shared a lot of experiences, anecdotes of what is happening. And I really hope I'm following Indyhall because I really enjoyed reading through your blog. To all of you out there, if you're interested in getting to know more about also how to virtually co-work together with Indyhall, check out indyhall.org. And of course, follow Virtual Space here. We're going to publish out of this conversation also a blog article about how to create better communities through better co-working. And with that, Alex, I'm saying thank you again. Thank you very much for being with us. You know that I have prepared a short virtual cocktail backstage, so I'm joining you in a minute, okay?
Awesome.
See you there. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Virtual Space Hero community, thank you very much for joining us, also for sending us your questions in beforehand and the topics you would like to discuss. We were talking in the past month again about hybrid organizations, hybrid working leadership. Now we move to happy, healthy co-working and co-working in general. We took a lot of wisdom here from an area that is connected, of course, to our work in the organizational context when we consider activity-based working change projects. Next week, I have a surprise guest for you. I'm not announcing yet the name. We are going to talk about hybrid learning. So stay tuned and join us in the conversation. And with that, I'm leaving you and I'm wishing you a beautiful morning, afternoon, or a good night. And don't forget to become a virtual space hero. Bye.